Kør. Champions of Circumstance, the Prolog. 500 years ago, the demon emperor, Malthus, the enslaver, ruled over the entire continent of Almera, as he had already done for 1,000 years, having enslaved or killed anyone who dared stand against him. Malthus and his mortal allies had paradise on earth, a paradise paid for with the blood and anguish of the countless races working as slaves for their masters. Malthus' allies were few but terrifying. To the southeast, the great empire of the Scorpions, monstrous scorpions from the waist down, humanoid from the waist up, ruled all of the Talantar desert with an iron fist. In the northern mountains and in every corner of the world veins, the Win, a dark-skinned and sadistic elven race, ruled. In the great Samir jungle, the Arachne, a terrifying spider people, fueled their never-ending blood sacrifices to their self-proclaimed god queen with thousands upon thousands of slaves. To the south, the lizard men built titanic temples and monuments on the broken backs of hundreds of thousands of slaves. Finally, Malthus' own citadel, located in the northwestern corner of Almera, and a construction so foul that the land within 300 miles of it had withered and died, leaving a dry and scarred wasteland. Malthus' cruelty made even his allies pale in comparison. He and his legions of demons tortured and murdered entire races for sport and entertainment alone. He flayed children alive in front of their parents. He melted the body and stripped the soul from millions of mortals to power his engines of war. He committed horrors and atrocity which are incomprehensible in the mortal tongue, and he revelled in each and every death he caused. Malthus was the supreme ruler of all Almera. Everyone bowed before him. Even the god queen of the Arachne feared his wrath. All bowed, all but one race. One race which had stood against him since he invaded Almera from his homeplane in the abyss. The Yursong. The Yursong, a race of mighty polar bear people, lived on the ever-frozen islands of Makua. They were the only free-willed race left in Almera, and they had been fighting a bloody war with Malthus' armies since they invaded 1,000 years ago. The Yursong had kept Malthus at bay for 1,000 years, but even they could not win against the endless hordes of demons Malthus had called forth from the abyss. The Yursong knew they could not last much longer alone, so, as a last resort and through great effort, they engineered a magical vessel that would be able to travel through the dreaded fog Malthus had summoned around the entire continent, which made leaving and entering by sea route impossible. The Yursong managed to traverse the fog and reach the Great Sea. From there, they set sail towards the capital of the ancient ally, the High Elves of Morena. The High Elves were struck with horror when they heard what fate had befallen Almera. Fearful of what could happen to the rest of the world if Malthus was able to conquer the Yursong and thereby all of the continent, the High Elves swore to aid in the liberation of the continent. Messages were sent to all corners of the Highland realms and to the great human empire in the south, calling for assistance to drive back the greatest evil the world had seen in many millennia. The call was answered, and within a year of the Yursong's arrival to the Highland realms, the greatest fleet the world had ever seen was heading towards Almera. The Yursong had shared the knowledge of traversing the mist with the Highland Council of Arcanists, who had perfected the method and assured the safe landfall of every ship in the enormous fleet. The combined armies of the human empire and the Highland realms struck the western shores of Almera and marched upon the land of the Arachne. The Arachne, too proud and confident in their own strength, saw the approaching armies as the perfect opportunity to prove their worth to Malthus. This was a mistake. Greatly outnumbered and outmatched, the Arachne were beaten back into their capital in a matter of weeks. And when they realized their mistake in trying to take on the invading force on their own, it was already too late. Driven into a corner, the God Queen of the Arachne emerged from her palace of horrors and struck out at her enemies with almost divine power. A titanic battle between the God Queen and the High-Elven Council of Grand Arcanists unfolded in the center of the capital. The battle was so intense and magic so powerful was released that even the gods were struck with awe. The battle lasted 4 days and 4 nights, and neither the liberating army of humans and elves nor the opposing army of Arachne dared interfere. At the dawn of the 5th day, a terrible scream erupted from within the city. The earth cracked open and swallowed up half the capital before closing again. Thunder roared, and the wind howled while black lightning crackled across the sky. All a result of the monstrous battle that had occurred, and still both armies stood still, waiting for the victor to show. After what felt like years for the combatants, something could finally be seen through the dust that filled the air around the capital. Out from the dust, 2 High-Elven Arcanists stumbled through the debris of battle. The 2 were the only survivors of the 9 High Councillors who entered the city. At this moment, the Arachne surrendered. Broken, they put down their weapons and turned themselves over as captives. This was the first victory in the long campaign against Molotov. With the Arachne defeated and the races they had enslaved and oppressed freed, the joint army of humans, elves, and former slaves struck further into Elmira. The war was long and bloody, and every mile of land was paid for with the lives of good soldiers. But as the liberating armies advanced, their numbers grew and grew. For every countryside, town, city, and metropolis where Moltos and his allies were beaten back, former slaves rose up and joined the battle, fighting for freedom and revenge against the monsters who had abused and enslaved them for a millennium. As the war continued and news of the master's armies spreading, the people living in fear and oppression started to see hope. Soon, slave rebellions plagued Moltos' allies. But even though his empire was being invaded, his allies beaten back, and their slaves revolting, Moltos' own slaves did not see hope, because they had witnessed his horrifying power and terrible cruelty firsthand, and they knew that nothing in this world could stand up to his might. After 12 years of war and countless dead on both sides, the army of liberation was closing in on the grand temple city Aku-Na'u. When the lizardmen saw that defeat was near, they performed a feat of magic that the world had never seen before. With the blood of an incomprehensible number of slaves and the power released from the sacrifice, together with the power of every living priest and mage in the empire, the lizardmen ripped a huge chunk of land loose from Elmira's coast and moved it 1,000 miles away from the mainland. The lizardmen had left most of their land completely undefended when they moved Aku-Na'u, meaning that the slaves left behind could be liberated with minimal losses. Those freed quickly turned their attention north, towards the Wynn. The Wynn, suffering greatly under slave rebellions and the intensified attack from the liberating army, abandoned their surface strongholds and retreated underground to the dark cities far beneath the surface, leaving the Scorpions and a furious Moltos demon army to fight off the invaders. As the Wynn retreated, the way to Moltos' own fortress had been opened, and soon the collected army of all Elmira's races and their liberators stood at Moltos' doorstep. The Scorpions had by now been pressed back to the capital and could not aid Moltos. Thus, the enslaver was alone. The armies of good and evil clashed in the shadow of Moltos' giant citadel, and even though the demon army was vast beyond understanding, it was being beaten back by the collective strength of the hundreds upon hundreds of races who had lived in bondage under Moltos' rule for 1,000 years, and who now struck back at him with all their wrath and hate. But, just as victory seemed at hand, Moltos himself emerged from the gates at the heart of his evil empire, wielding a giant mace in one hand and a colossal sword in the other. He took on wave after wave of soldiers, crushed champions, and slaughtered heroes. He seemed both immortal and unstoppable, slaying his foes by the thousands. He alone was turning the tide of battle. With the Emperor finally at their side and the enemy wavering, the demon army fought with renewed bloodlust. Just as the battle seemed lost and the retreat was about to be sounded, a thundering roar filled the air. The Yuuzhan had arrived. The demonic armies who had invaded their homeland had been without reinforcements, and the Yuuzhan had used the opportunity to crush them and take back their land. After having driven out the last demons, the Yuuzhan had heard about the coming battle at the Black Citadel and set sail towards the mainland, not a second too late. The Yuuzhan, led by their warrior king Naruk, charged the demons, decimating every foe in sight. At the sight of the legendary Yuuzhan, who had held their own against Molot's endless armies for 1,000 years, the fleeing soldiers rallied once more. But still, it wasn't enough. The demons fell left and right, many fleeing into the citadel, terrified by the almost otherworldly might of the Yuuzhan. But Molot's did not falter. Even before the might of the legendary Yuuzhan, he could not be defeated. He tossed aside even the most towering of Yuuzhan like they were nothing, and laughed as their weapons broke upon his body. Still, he brought carnage to his enemies. Molot stood before the gates of his citadel and single-handedly held the largest army the world had ever seen at bay. Nothing could stop him. The corpses of slain foes littered the ground before him, and still he showed no signs of slowing down. It was at this moment Naruk emerged from the rank of his warriors, calling out Molot, demanding that he meet him in single combat. Molot, drunk in the carnage he brought, tossed back his head and laughed, a laughter that was quickly silenced as Naruk's first blow landed. The earth shook and quaked around Molot as he just barely managed to block Naruk's mighty axe. The following battle was unlike any ever witnessed. No magic was involved, only pure war strength. And still, the world heaved as Molot and Naruk exchanged blows. The sky splitting in two under the thundering clash of their weapons, and Molot, once believed to be immortal, now bled. The battle lasted over an hour, with every blow carrying enough weight to send giants flying, and the shockwaves from their clashing weapons tearing up the ground and echoing for miles around. And then, amidst all the chaos and destruction, the duel suddenly ended. Naruk's axe had slipped past Molot's defenses and tore through his black armor, mortally wounding him, and, at the same time, Molot's sword found Naruk's heart. Both were dead before they hit the ground. The age of the enslaver was over, Elmira was freed once again, and a new sun was dawning. Now, 1,500 years after the demonic invasion, and 500 years since the war against Molot, the continent is at peace. Civilization has flourished, and the annual festival in the human capital is approaching. And with it, a busy time for Quintoris, the half-elf thief. Thank you, and have a good day.